So without further ado, I will let Katie take it away and introduce her work at Lorain County.
Okay, thank you so much. This is really diving right into the topic, but the story for the adaptive courseware in my classroom began in fall 2017. The textbook that I was using at the time had made available Wiley Plus Adaptive Practice as part of the suite of courseware that came with the textbook anyhow. At the time, I had been looking for something to sort of fill the gap between the section level homework and the high stakes exams. At that time, we had 2 big midterm exams and then a common final where each midterm covered about 3 chapters. So you can imagine it was going 0 to 60 for these students, and they were just blindsided a lot of times by those exams. So I wanted to have something sort of to fill that gap. I had already developed some lab assignments that were over a chapter's worth of material where they started to synthesize ideas, but I think that felt more like a project and didn't come with the anxiety of exam taking. So still there was a hole to plug. And so that's when I first tried out the adaptive quizzes, and it has evolved over time for sure. I no longer use Wiley Plus Adaptive Practice, but most of my experience is with that. So I'm going to cover that in depth, show you some of the dashboards and what it looked like there, and then bring you up to speed to this semester where I'm using Wiley Plus Adaptive Assignments powered by Newton, which does not exactly roll off the tongue, but it did offer many other perks. So this is an overview of my first experience with adaptive technology. This originally was called Orion, and they eventually branded it as Wiley Plus Adaptive Practice. It was quite complicated for students. So I have the process that students would go through delineated there on the left. So there would be 1 chapter went with 1 quiz, and every chapter students would start off by rating their confidence level. They would take a 20-question diagnostic. They would review their reports that shows what they knew well and what they didn't. And then they still were not done. This took me years, and I still had students missing this fact every single semester. But they were not done after the diagnostic. They had to go back in and view their reports to identify their weakest areas. And they did not get a grade until they completed at least 20 more questions to meet a 40-question minimum. So you see, I have this memorized. I've gone over this for about 4 years. So now 40 is the minimum number of questions. If students were unhappy with their grade at that point in time, they could always go through and answer more questions to try and improve their proficiency. There was this awkward connection between proficiency score and grade. And so that's what you see at the bottom of the slide. The scale on the bottom there, the blue numbers are proficiency scores, which have a very convoluted way of being calculated. I'll spare you the details there. And the upward numbers in black there, they are the grades that would go with that threshold. So you can see that this was a little bit confusing for students. That last picture there where it says chapter 1 collecting data, that's really what it looked like from the student view after they completed their diagnostic. So green means they got the question right, red means it was wrong, orange means it was partially correct. And they can drill down in all the way to the question level. As far as the instructor end goes, the one thing I really liked about adaptive practice was it was very in your face. It was not easy to miss at all what students were doing well at and what they were not getting. You could look at the chapter level to see typically how many questions students were answering and how many they got right. You could see by the section level, and then you could even identify those tricky questions that ended up in the mix that almost everybody got wrong. So there was lots of data available, and it was easy to point out where the difficulties lied. So at this point, I've used this all the way up until spring 2021. So this was very recent. And we actually, as part of a grant with Every Learner Everywhere, we scaled it up. And so I required everyone to assign these in their stats course. And so everybody got to give the spiel of how you do these assignments to their students, and their students messed it up every time too. So the learning curve was very high, and it caused a lot of frustration for students. They thought they were done and they weren't, or they can't seem to get their proficiency score up to the grade that they're trying to get. They feel like they're spinning their wheels. So you might wonder, why did I scale it up in the first place? I felt like there were two major wins with this technology. The first win was I could really easily identify which students needed some personal attention. So if you see the report here, each line I cut off the students' names, but each line corresponds to a student. And you can see under performance how many questions they answered, and that's only for one chapter, and how many they got right, how long it took them, their proficiency score, and then the deviation is whether they went up from the diagnostic or down from the diagnostic score. So very quickly, I could see those students at the bottom and send them a quick intervention email. If it was an on-campus class, I could pull them aside and ask if there was any help that I could give. The other thing was that at the end of the term, I ran a multiple regression, and I found that considering all of the different things in that scaffolded approach that I had to the assessment of the students, of all the things, the Wiley plus adaptive practice was the #1 predictor of success on exams. And as you probably noticed, exams are the main assessment tool in the course. So that's where I was up until spring 2021. New edition came out for the book, and they made the decision for me over at Wiley that they now are going to offer adaptive assignments powered by Newton for my textbook. So I was really looking forward to hopefully having a simpler process. And in fact, I did. So one thing to keep in mind, I'm actually on sabbatical this semester, so I only am teaching one section, and it's only online. It's not synchronous. So that's the only experience I have with these adaptive assignments so far. But I can tell you, no one is confused as far as how to complete the assignments. You jump in and you start answering questions. It's very simple. You either get the questions right or you get them wrong. If you get them wrong, the student has a full written out solution with any necessary calculations and sentences explaining where the answers are coming from. So the students picked it up like that. There was no learning curve. So lots less headaches for students and faculty alike, which was great. Another thing that had been an issue in adaptive practice was, as students were missing questions, their proficiency score and grade would continue to go either up or down if they missed questions and up if they got them correct. So let's say they got to the 80%. They were sometimes afraid to keep working to go for the 100 because they were afraid they would lose their 80%. Well, these adaptive assignments using Newton don't do that. It is the case that their progress will increase or decrease with correct answers or incorrect answers, but there are built-in benchmarks. So if I have demonstrated proficiency over 80% of the learning objectives, I get that 80 on my score, whether or not I start missing questions again. So it really allows students to continue working in the system without risking their grade. So the whole thing was definitely more user-friendly. And if you can go ahead to the next slide. At the end of each assignment, this is a stagnant picture of the celebration that occurs, but it's actually animated and it's very encouraging. Like, hey, you got 100%. that was very much lacking in Wiley Plus. You got 100% by getting 70% proficiency or higher. So you didn't ever quite feel like you got it all, you know, versus this, you've demonstrated that you learned all of the learning objectives. You get a whole mini celebration in your honor. The second picture that you see there, actually, if you could go back, I wanted to make sure to point this out. I'm still using the assignment to plug that gap between homework and exam. The technology, however, can be used in a different way. And that is, there's actually 3 different intentions that you can set for these assignments. It can be either pre-lecture, where I haven't even told them anything about the topic. I want them to go read the book and answer these questions to get them involved in the material. And I can then use the reports to steer my lecture, to target what most students were having difficulty with. So that is one way that you could use data to inform your teaching. I have run a class that way. My discrete math class used a totally different system. I used the Learn Smart and Smart Book assignments there. It was a little bit more of a stressful experience, and those discrete math students were a higher level. That's a sophomore level course. They were able to handle that a lot better versus the stat students. There's virtually no prerequisite anymore. We use a co-requisite instead. And so we have students of varying abilities. So instead I do have lectures available through interactive videos still. Anyhow, so this is a review assignment. So they have already practiced some, they've had the lecture, they've practiced some, and they're starting to synthesize. And so I can see how they're doing on the sections. These assignments, instead of covering an entire chapter, they will cover 2 to 3 sections at a time. And that really helps students keep from giving up, which was an issue before. Okay, so here we see some of the other reports that I get out of adaptive assignments powered by Newton. You can see that this was for chapter 4. They estimate that a student should be able to complete this in 6 to 10 questions. You see a quick snapshot of how the class did overall. And there to the right, each one of those rows are an individual student. And so just to point out a couple students here right away, you see who needs the intervention, right? It says struggling right there. So that gets your attention right away. That poor student answered 89 questions in 16 minutes and only got through 60% of the assignment. So that's their grade at this point. That student needs a different intervention than, say, the student 2 lines down who answered 88 questions in 34 minutes, but got 100%. I still think that student needs an intervention. They have a perfect score. So if I only saw the grade, I might think, oh yeah, they're doing great. But remember, it was estimated that they should be answering only 6 to 10 questions. So I'm suspicious here that that student's guessing and had a lucky day. So I'm still going to send an intervention out to that student. I'd say probably the student who did the best here is the one that answered the least number of questions. They did it very quickly, 10 questions in 8 minutes, not bad. They get their 100 and move on with their life. So I wanted to kind of, oh, there's another student who needs an intervention here. Do you see it? 2 hours and 49 minutes that student took to answer 41 questions. That student needs to be reached out to as well. If it's taking some students 8 minutes and some students 2 hours and 49 minutes, somebody's at risk of getting burnout, and it's going to be the 2 hour and 49 minute student. So as a math teacher, you know, grading math is very straightforward. They do the steps right or they don't. And so before the pandemic, you know, I would have paper exams and grade them right, wrong. There was not a lot of feedback as far as writing out encouraging sentences. But if you go to the next slide, you can see what some of my interventions look like now. So I started a Microsoft Word document, and I'm sure there's a better way to organize all of this. but describing scenarios and what I want to say to a student in that scenario. So here's what I would say to someone who the deadline passed and they had no grade in the grade book. I've noticed that you don't have a grade for the Chapter 2 Adaptive Practice Part 1. It's either because you didn't complete the assignment or because you did not correctly complete questions on at least half of the learning objectives. I decided to reopen the quiz until Wednesday so that you can complete it. This will be a firm deadline. And then I give some advice on how to successfully complete it if they are just struggling, and that's why it didn't get finished. And hopefully this extension gets you back on track. Now, I am very stingy with extensions on static assignments because I usually release the answers. And once the answers are out there, it's hard to accept something late. But because of this being a dynamic assignment, it really allows for me to be more generous and let students continue to work. Another example of an intervention email. This would be for the student who earned 100% but had to answer 2 to 3 times the number of questions compared to other students. So what I would say to that student, I just wanted to say that I noticed how hard you worked to successfully complete the Chapter 2 Adaptive Quiz Part 1. Nice job on earning 100%. I am a little concerned at the number of questions you needed to answer to get there though. The system indicates that you spent, and then I would fill in the blank of how many minutes and how many questions on that one assignment. That isn't really what I had in mind, as I know you most likely have a lot of other responsibilities on your plate and would rather not be answering statistics questions all day. And then I give the same advice as I had on the other slide. Okay. So now you get to know how friendly my emails are. The data comparing adaptive quizzes with Newton and exams is really different from what I saw with the other adaptive technology. Students either get 100% or they don't for the most part. This was exam 1, which covered 2 chapters and had 3 quizzes over that material. So you do see some variation in the adaptive quiz scores, but almost everything stacked up to 100% as far as their average on the quiz. And then there's this great variation in how they did on the exam. I think I need to play with the settings here. And actually, instead of choosing a review as the intention, there's a third option, and that's practice, which makes them answer a few more questions. So maybe those students who got lucky by guessing would not do so and actually have to try and think about some of these questions. And that's actually all I have. And I want to go ahead and hand it over to Greg to talk about how he uses Alex.
And actually, before we hand it to Greg, thank you so much, Katie. We did get a couple questions specific to the timing and the courseware that you were using, both Wiley Practice and the Newton Alta. The first, we kind of noticed from S. McCarthy that there seemed to be a correlation between the amount of time used and the success rates of students that we saw in the other courseware that might not always align. Right. But did you find any ways to entice students to increase their time or perhaps use their time more valuably before intervening after seeing their scores?
I do think it helped to be able to point out the typical student who was successful answered this many questions in this amount of time. I think that the temptation there is to rush. And so they maybe didn't read carefully enough. There's a lot of motivation in these adaptive systems to be overly cautious, because once you miss a question, you have to work that much harder to get your progress back up. And so I did have to have that conversation multiple times with students for sure. And just because you answer more questions, that spinning over the wheels thing definitely did happen. There were students who would spend 3 hours on an adaptive practice assignment and still not get above 50% in their proficiency.
Got it. I think that's really helpful to consider. You know, we we do get so much data from these dashboards, but it's really making sure we're diving in to see what relates and what interventions we might actually need depending on those other factors. Like you pointed out, just seeing 100% doesn't always mean that it went that well for the student if they're spending 3 hours. So that's really helpful. And one other question that we had before we move on to Greg from Julie Neisler was, have you seen positive impacts as a result of these interventions from those emails you're contacting students with or other pieces there?
It's funny because the one that I started off congratulating, hey, you worked really hard, they would write back apologizing to me. So I thought, I tried to make this as encouraging as possible, but then they still felt like they were in trouble somehow. So maybe I need to fine tune that. But in a strictly asynchronous online class, I didn't normally have that amount of individual contact with students. It was a lot of discussion forum posts and announcements and videos and not a lot of this is only to you. And so I think the students have appreciated that. We are really scaling up our course assessment process at LCCC this term. I'm in charge of making sure everyone is assessing our outcomes in using the same metric. So what I'm really looking forward to doing is on that common final, taking the questions that correspond to our learning objectives and comparing the sections that used adaptive to those that did not. There were a few other colleagues that are piloting the Newton assignment, so I'm really looking forward to that.
It's always great to have those base pieces to compare to. Well, thank you again so much, Katie, and I'm sure we'll come back with more questions at the end, but I will pass the mic now to Greg and start driving your slides. So Greg, take it away.
Sounds great. All right, so let me tell you what we've been doing at Cleveland State with Alex. So let's go ahead and I have some background prepared. Pre-calculus at Cleveland State consists of 167, which is our college algebra class, and 168, which is our trigonometry class. And I've been teaching here at Cleveland State since 2008, and I can recall using Alex, whether I was an instructor or whether I was the coordinator of pre-calculus like I am now, for over 10 years. So I've seen all the different interfaces that it's gone through, the improvements that Alex has made over 10 years. And it was pretty good 10 years ago too. But we also teach under the coordinated model because we have so much enrollment and these lower division courses. There was an initiative years ago that we didn't used to be coordinated, say 8 years ago, but there was an initiative to have these, especially 100 level courses where every student has the same experience. One instructor is put in charge of creating all the exams and all the content, and that's simply distributed to the other instructors who act as teachers. So we've been doing that coordination for a while, and I used to work as an instructor under coordination. Now I am I still am for calculus, but I am the coordinator there for 4 years. And basically, we just try to keep our pre-calculus pass rates as high as possible. And they have been pretty high, although I'll talk about what's happened during virus times a little bit later. But Alex, I will show you a few basic pictures of Alex. My presentation is not intended to be a presentation of everything Alex can do, but my presentation is intended to be what can we as humans do in the classroom and even outside the classroom, I guess, to adapt further to Alex's data that it gives us. And Alex is already adaptive in some sense in terms of its algorithm, the way that it takes different students through different routes to get through all the objectives and so on. But this is what we are going to go ahead and this is what we've been doing and what we plan on continuing to do and keep on tweaking every term. So we can go to the next slide, I guess. All right, so what I have here, the very first slide is is a screenshot from Alex. You see up there, it says objective 9, 10, and 11. And under 11, there's a bunch of topics there. This is taken from my Math 167. And I actually took this screenshot earlier this week because we're in our last objective. There are 11 objectives that make up the 15-week course. And here is the material. You see a lot of systems of equations is what we're closing out the college algebra course with here. So you can see the different progresses on the right. Objective 10 closed out last week. My class was able to complete it to 89% completion, it looks like, across the board. And then I think the due date for this one was on Monday night this past week. So you can see that as you look at the data, there are some topics that the class has mastered better, such as simplifying a sum or difference of multivariate polynomials, even down lower, solving a system of linear equations using substitution. These are all things that are above 90% completion for, I believe I have 37 in this section, 37 students. And then we look at some other topics that have, well, still decent completion rates, but lower. For example, finding time to reach a limit on a word problem in exponential growth or decay. That's 74%, something outside of the realm of systems of equations, but it's included in this topic. And then there at the very bottom, the lowest one, which again, still a strong majority of the class has mastered at 71%. But again, what do they say? You're only as strong as your weakest student as a teacher, and that's kind of the approach that we take in terms of instruction and design when analyzing this data. So in essence, when I go ahead, let's say that, and again, it's late in the semester and a lot of this stuff has been filled out, but let's say that I was looking at this data and I wanted to construct a review for chapter 11 in the classroom. Well, in fact, I partially did that today. Earlier on in class, I constructed a review for exam 3 with some of these objectives, but instantly I know that if I'm going to create a review for today, it should definitely include the very last topic there, solving a distance rate time problem. It should definitely include the one that's at 74%, finding time to reach a word problem in exponential growth or decay. And my review probably doesn't have to include solving a system of linear equations using substitution, because only 6% of the class hasn't had that mastered yet. So in fact, I and my instructors, and this has been going on for, well, since about 2019, I would say, so 2 years. The instructors and I are directed to not look at your teaching every day as a static thing off of some syllabus that was presented at the beginning of the term, but to look at your teaching every day in terms of crafting day-to-day lessons based on what your class needs the most versus what your class needs the least. Now, if we can go to the next slide. You see, this is the same, it looks like the same picture, but this is my morning class instead of my afternoon class. So I think the last one was my afternoon class. They're doing a little better. My morning class, you see that this screenshot was taken at the same time, but these percentages are pretty, they're lower across the board. I wouldn't say they're terribly low. A lot of them are majorities, but you can see that these are more in the 70s and 50s rather than 90s and 70s. So when I construct a lesson for this class on Objective 11, let's say I want to review parts of that, this class looks like they might need a more general review. And while I still might leave some of the highest topics out, it's probably not a good idea to leave out a topic that's at 76% as opposed to, say, 90% on the previous slide. So I would say that this class might need more of a general review of everything, whereas the other class, you can be a little bit more focused in your preparation in terms of classroom day-to-day, what you're going to go ahead and teach in the classroom. Now, I will say this, as coordinator over the last 4 years, my team has generally been me and part-timers. So part-timers will generally be more receptive to me saying, this is what I want you to do on a day-to-day basis. This is how I want you to teach. This may be a little bit more difficult to implement if you are, and again, because we teach under a coordinated system, if you are implementing this on an instructor who's more set in their ways, so to speak. But basically all the instructors that I work with very few exceptions, have been open to peaking at Alex the day that you go in to teach to make sure that your lesson is crafted to be as efficient as possible for that day. All right, can we move ahead to the next slide? Again, you see I have here, instead of a predetermined day-to-day topic by topic course schedule, objectives are considered weekly goals. So objective 11, the one we've been analyzing, was last week's objective. And then this week is devoted to review for their last test, review for the final exam, and well, they'll take that test on Friday and the final next week. But Objective 11 was the goal last week, but that doesn't mean that I break down the topics. These are Monday, these are Wednesday, these are Friday. Objectives are considered weekly goals, and instructors are expected to review objective data in ALEX every day before they go in to teach their section. If a topic has high percentage completion amongst the section, it can be avoided or have only a small amount of time devoted to it during the day's lecture. If a topic has low percentage completion, it should be drilled more during the lecture. Two different sections of the same course might get different lectures in the same day. Not only might they should, and I know that because I teach two sections of Math 167 here this term, and I've done that, and that's what I expect the other instructors under coordination to do as well. So that's adaptive as far as instruction goes, but as far as course design goes, I want to show you a few more shots of ALEX. And again, ALEX has just a wealth of data, all the stuff, I shouldn't say all the stuff, but some of the things I saw in Katie's presentation about how much time your students have spent in the system, that's all kept track of in ALEX. And incidentally, we found that our line of success tends to be about 4 hours per week. The students who spend less than 4 hours per week in ALEX don't do as well as the students who spend 4 hours or more per week in ALEX. I don't have a slide of the exact data for that today, but that's what we found historically over, I don't know, me and my predecessors as coordinator in pre-calc over 10 years or so. But anyway, this slide is a slide of extra homework, not a bonus homework. This is still part of the student's normal homework regimen. But in addition to completing the Objective 11 by a Friday night, all the objectives are due on Friday night. And that's the main topics in the pie charts in ALEX that we're trying to fill out and get 100% of the slices of pie completed by the end of the term so that the student demonstrates essentially mastery of the course. And this is another assignment that we call assignments that you can create in ALEX. And this is supplemental to the objectives, just so that students get more immersion. But before 2019, these used to be static things for us, and I'll explain how they become dynamic and adaptive now under the current system. But you see we have 7 questions here, and these are selected from the topics of Objective 11. And the assignments are due on Monday nights, and the way that the assignments are constructed, and this didn't happen until the APLU visited us with the adaptive initiative, and the deans and the chair of the department liked it and directed me to go ahead and, well, make things more adaptive, even though you're using adaptive software already. So rather than having extra immersion in a 7-question static assignment, what we do is, I've done this at first, but essentially I've trained my graduate assistant to do this now, is on Friday night when the assignment is done, or the objective is done, I'm sorry, the data that you saw in the previous slides is used to construct these assignments, is used to construct these supplemental assignments. And not only that, but the data section per section is used to construct a potentially different 7-question assignment for each section. Under coordination at Cleveland State, we're supposed to keep the exams all the same, essentially, and the quizzes all the same, essentially, and the material the same. But we have a little bit of leeway in the way that we can design the homework. And so rather than a static assignment that was picked out 7 questions at the beginning of the term, maybe these will be helpful and letting it set like that. What we do now is we create the second homework assignment related to the material, specifically based off of some of the deficiencies in what we see in the objective. So out of the 7 questions that you see here, all 7 of them aren't going to be the lowest 7 that we see, but I might pick 2 easy, 2 medium, and 3 hard based on the percentages that I see. The hard ones will definitely probably be the lowest 3. And then the other 4, even if they're not the lowest, will be things that I think apply to the most problems or apply to the section the most in general. But always at least 3 of the 7 of these will be selected specifically for the section. And again, there are 7 sections of pre-calculus total at Cleveland State right now. I teach 3 of them. These assignments might be different section per section based on the data that we see on Friday nights before they're constructed by Saturday at noon. So if we could go to the next slide, you'll see this is the same assignment, but for a different section. And here I just have selected, well, my graduate assistant must have selected different problems at the time that this data went down. She must have looked at this and said, well, they must need general review on everything, because you can see the system of equation stuff at 4, 5, 6, 7, but other things that aren't system of equations in 1, 2, 3. Can we go backwards a slide? And then you see in this one, my graduate assistant must have determined that the data said they must be doing good on the exponential stuff. Let's just make it all systems of equations related for all 7 of these problems here. So this is not student to student, but this is section to section, different sections of the same class, getting a little bit different of supplemental material. That still counts for a grade, that's still part of the homework, but based on data that we've taken directly from what they have worked on in the objective the week before. So if we can move ahead 2 slides, I guess. So right there, that's right. So again, we talked about in the classroom what I did to prepare going into classroom day, looking at ALEX before, but also throughout the semester, even though ALEX again is adaptive itself, we can adapt our course design. Objectives are the main homework of the course, representing all topics to be learned. These are the same for all students. Assignments are more homework tailored to each individual section based on data from the objectives. I or my GA review the data for each individual section on Friday nights, then construct a different 7-question assignment for each section by Saturday afternoon, chosen from topics in the objective. Each assignment is designed to contain topics that a particular section has not shown a high percentage of mastery yet, thus immersing individual section in what they need the most. So that's been going on for, I think, almost 3 years now. This started in 2019 because I took over as coordinator at 2018, and all of 2018, these things were static, so to speak. 2019, they started being adaptive. So next slide, please. And what this is just an excerpt of, and this is kind of old, but just to summarize the general idea of how things are. The beginning of this is the before, so this is probably like end of 2018, beginning of 2019. We still had the objective and assignment structure, but it was static. You can see that assignments have evolved. It says 5 topics then, but I guess we're doing 7 now. Quizzes actually it says 2 topics, but there are 3 questions now. So again, these are, we had the assignment system in place, we had ALEX in place, but essentially we're trying to squeeze every extra edge we can using adaptivity. So you see after the initiative to take a more active role in week-to-week homework preparation, the course coordinator and course coordinator's assistant have recently began reviewing each separate pre-calculus section's results on the objectives after, I guess our objectives used to be due Thursday night a few years ago, now they're due Friday night. And using that information to construct the assignments due Sunday night, well, I guess due Monday night now, but same general idea of finish the objective during the week and then do the adaptive thing over the weekend. Questions for the assignments are selected by choosing the 2 lowest scoring objectives for that particular class section, as well as 3, again, 5 has evolved to 7 problems for these homeworks now. Because the performance between sections can vary from topic to topic, this process ensures that each specific section gets more assigned problems on the topics that seem to be the most difficult for students in that section, and thus get more practice on what they need the most as a class. And you can see that that arrow process there, when it says review, that's an active review by me or my grad assistant as we go ahead and select and create week to week assignments for the course tailored to each individual section. Next slide. Well, I guess the next slide is the last slide. So that's what we're doing in 2 different ways. Again, using an already adaptive software, but adapting as humans, both in terms of day-to-day instruction planning, as well as week-to-week homework planning, just to try to squeeze every possible edge that we can. And again, as far as numbers go, our pre-calc rates before I took over as coordinator were in the 60s. While I was coordinator, they went up to the low 80s, and a lot of that was the fact that I have a great team around me, and I'm not just being humble when I say that. A lot of people, Cleveland State's very well supported. Pre-calculus is supported here by supplemental instruction that's mandatory, attendance is required, so double periods, things like that. During the virus, our pass rates took a hit back down to in the 60% again, but I'm operating under the assumption that the many confounding factors related to the virus is why that is. And I'm interested to see the data this semester because except for a mask mandate on campus, and again, I'm not aware of one because I'm in a private office, but except for a mask mandate on campus, things have been pretty business as usual here. We're back to full hallways, full classrooms, commitment to in-person instruction. So I will say in 2019, the data was still in the low 80s. So what we were doing certainly didn't hurt anything, but I feel like perhaps if there are other factors or other things that haven't been considered, this kind of adaptive practices, I don't see how it could be harmful, and I think it could be helpful.
Excellent. That was wonderful, Greg, to kind of get that different sense and see what similarities there are between you and Lorain. So we will now move into our question and answer. And pardon me, I'm getting us all spot lit here so we can see all of our presenters' wonderful faces. But one question that I have, or that was asked during Greg's portion, and Katie might also have some feelings, but do you share with your students how you're constructing your reviews, how you're kind of using that data from the dashboards, or why those lectures might vary from course to course if they have friends in different courses or might be talking to their classmates? Do you provide that information?
I can go ahead and start and say, yes, I do. I tell my students, I show them those interfaces on 2 projectors, and I got the computer in front right here, 2 projectors, and I like point at the percentages and I say, I think we can avoid this today, but I think we're going to work on this today. And that my students are aware of how the instructors, including me, are supposed to and do prepare their day-to-day lectures. My students are aware that the assignment that they get may be different than the assignment that a different section gets, and it doesn't seem to be a problem. I think if it were exams, maybe that would be something different, but under coordination, we really can't have different exams. But my students are fully aware of the process as I can make them, and they don't seem to hate it.
And my process is pretty different from Greg's. I'm really admiring your fluidity and the fact that you can adapt. I'm much more rigid of a person. I need order and whatnot. And so I don't necessarily adapt my teaching in the way that you do. But one thing with Wiley Plus, at least, was last time I taught with adaptive in person, I would, after every exam, make a scatter plot and a linear regression showing students the connection between the adaptive quizzes and exam performance, and showing them some of these dashboards to say, look, this is a tool. This is your warning sign. If you're not doing well on these, that means you should keep working. And so I'll reopen those assignments to give them the opportunity to use it as a study tool. And certainly answer questions that are commonly missed in the review session as well. But there's much more of the adaptive stuff happening outside of class time in my class.
That makes sense. And just thinking on the topic of students, so we've talked a lot about what you use as instructors or as coordinators to help guide that instruction or provide interventions, but what feedback do you get from your students, or how do you onboard them to the data that they get to see? And we'll start with Katie and then go back to Greg.
Sure. It was a mixed bag. Like I said, I haven't really had as close of a connection with the asynchronous online students as I would have in a synchronous or on campus class, but I do plan on collecting data to see what students think, because they have been so quiet about the adaptive technology, which right away makes me feel like maybe it's going better, because they were not quiet about it before. It was mostly complaining, but rightfully so. But yes, I do plan on collecting data to see what their thoughts are. I see it as this huge tool that could help them, really learn their stuff. And I'm hoping that they're seeing it in the same way.
I would say that to say that my students are incredibly excited about having adaptive components in their course probably isn't true. I mean, they know what's going on, but I don't know if they feel pumped about it compared to their other courses. But a way that you can use data at least collect the data in these systems that you know is accurate to motivate a student. This is what I would say is that my experience is a student comes up to me and says, man, my first test was bad. What can I do to improve my grade? That'll always happen sometime around the beginning of October. So what I do in ALEX is I sit them down in ALEX, I bring up all their data, and the one thing that I point to, which we mentioned in the chat, and is I see the what's the low-hanging fruit of collecting data, maybe the most the least amount of new change for the most amount of gains, or whatever, as you could put it. I sit down with the student and I say, here's your hours in ALEX. This is how much you spent in ALEX. And I divide it by the number of weeks. And I say, there's that threshold of 4. If you're under 4, it means you weren't doing what you're supposed to be doing, but it means there's a lot of room for improvement. And if you say that, well, then the student doesn't get discouraged. And if their hours are over 4, well, then I've got to try something else. But that's probably the one thing that will get a student who goes out of their way to ask you, or even doesn't, even if you approach a student, if you say, look, if you can get this 1.5 hours a week up to 4 hours a week, you will see that the improvement will happen naturally. That's the one that I found in the last 10 years or so that is the most motivating to students as far as data from these programs.
Got it. It helps to kind of have that trial and error, collect that data so you have that to present to students. As instructors, researchers, we love our own data, but it's great to have that to share with students, something easy for them to grasp and kind of a goal, but not just a box to check. And Katie, what would your advice be? Kind of that low-hanging fruit, an instructor new to adaptive, or just something if they're looking at all of these data points, what would you say they can start with?
I feel like what I'm doing is the low-hanging fruit because, like I said, the idea of going into class and having it be different in 2 different sections, what I'm doing, I think my brain would just explode. It's just not in my nature. But keeping track of, those interventions, whether it be in person, what you're going to say to them, or through email, I think that's probably the easiest change that you can make, because you can save it and reuse it. Just make sure you fill in that's why I highlighted the section so I don't forget to fill those in. Then they'll know my secret that I'm just copying and pasting it. But it's interesting because I'm in a community of practice, and the English faculty have had this sort of feedback for a long time, because your feedback when you're dealing with English composition is not just X check mark like in a math exam. It's very, whole sentences sometimes of feedback. And so they've been kind of keeping track of what that feedback might look like in some system or another. Mine's just a Word document, but I'd say that's the easiest way to get started.
I guess one other thing that I would say is that what I presented to you is how we're adaptive in lessons and how we're adaptive in homework. But one of the restrictions that I have to deal with because of the mandates of coordination at my university, which is not a problem, it's just the tests have to be the same and the quizzes have to be the same. The things that are the timed assessments have to be the same. But if it didn't have to be that way, I would take the data that shows where my each different section is deficient day to day, week to week, and I would create quizzes that immerse them in that in a testing environment, probably at lower stakes as far as the grade percentage is concerned. But I think, I don't want to use the word pressure, but putting the students in that environment of testing conditions with those things that they need to be immersed in the most would be the most valuable thing that I can't do yet. But if you could do it, I would do it that way. Maybe I would make the adaptive stuff quizzes instead of assignments.
That makes sense. We all have our own challenges and limits to work through, but there are ways that we can still personalize and really help support our students in individualized ways through those kind of general settings. So thank you both again, Greg and Katie, for presenting this information, sharing how you use data, taking the time with us today.